The day they called me an old ghost and handed me a visitor badge. I had made a joke in my head about ghosts having better memories than people. I stood in the rain and watched the glass tower swallow the sky like a polished lie, and for a second I saw in the reflection rows and rows of servers coughing like old men waking up to find they were suddenly famous. Later, much later, those servers would cough in a way that sounded like a verdict. Boards would scramble, cameras would find empty seats, and someone in a suit who had once told me I was past my time would be shouting my name into a mouthpiece. I did not know then how the day would end, only that it would end with them learning what architects look like when they stop being ignored. For now, I clutched the original folding blueprint that fit in my pocket like a secret, and I stepped into a lobby that did not recognize me. The lobby smelled like new money and lemon oil, the kind of cleanliness you buy to forget what you used to build with grease and cigarette smoke. Everything gleamed with histories that were someone else's. A digital sculpture pulsed with light where my old chalkboard had once stood. The names on a bronze plaque were the names investors liked to see, not the ones who stayed up nights writing code in the cold. My hands, which had once held soldering irons until my fingers smelled of copper and risk, trembled with age but not with weakness. I know these places like the lines on my palm. I could navigate their HVAC ducts with my eyes closed, find the forgotten maintenance corridors where a single switch could change the whole city's patience. The company had grown muscles and lost its skeleton, and the skeleton was still in my head. They met me at the front desk as if I were a rumor looking to be proven wrong. A young woman, hair pulled into a tight knot, and a name tag that read like a brand, smiled the way people do when they practice compassion as a procedure. She squinted at my face, as if trying to reconcile the person I had been in old photos with the man in front of her carrying a coat that had seen better winters. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, and when I said my name her smile didn't falter, but her eyes cooled the way a screen goes dark. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, and when I said I used to have this place, she laughed a small, clinical laugh that sounded like an algorithm rejecting input. Behind her, a stone sculpture of the current CEO glowed with studio lighting, and somewhere on the glass a ticker ran numbers and public praise. "We don't entertain claims," she said, the phrase precise, ceremonial. "This is a modern, forward-thinking organization. We have a timeline. Visitors need appointments." The contempt in that sentence wasn't loud. It was quiet and efficient and therefore more poisonous. They were children wearing suits that fit like confidence, and they believed with the terrible arrogance of youth that they had pulled everything up by themselves. They spoke of growth metrics and pivot strategies, of viral launches and brand narratives like people quoting scripture. They could recite the year's earnings margin and couldn't tell you what a relay sounded like when it died under load. One of them, taller and smugger, said, "We made it scalable, we made it enterprise-ready. The old ways don't apply." He said it as if he had discovered gravity, and I felt my chest tighten in a way that old men call pain and young men call inconvenience. I showed them an ID, not the kind they issue nowadays, but the kind that used to open safes and server rooms, and watched it mean nothing to them. "Historical reenactor," someone murmured. "Nice costume," someone else added, and the word costume cut into me like someone stabbing at a photograph. They tried to escort me to security, a perfunctory motion of removing a problem to a place designed to make people small. I wanted to shout and fill that glass cathedral with every line of code, every late-night decision, every unpaid rent and burned dinner that had built the first server rack in a garage. I wanted to tell them what a failed deploy smelled like and the way a successful one tasted. Instead, I smiled because smiling buys you a moment, and moments are where revolutions begin. They pushed me toward a door that said no entry in a font that thought it was clever. I felt the old, familiar geometry of the building map itself in my head. The service stair behind the mural, the maintenance hatch under the third stair tread, a line of dusty access panels that no one had touched since the first funding round. I carried a memory that was a key, a set of instructions folded into me, and their laughter only made those instructions clearer. I left the lobby slowly, cane tapping like a metronome, counting down a song they hadn't yet learned, and walked the perimeter with the casualness of someone counting the number of unread books in a library. People in branded hoodies passed me and wore the future like an accessory, eyes glazed with the ease of inherited power. A coffee cup had the new logo, a logo that looked nothing like the ink sketches I kept in my wallet. I could feel the heat of being dismissed burning a slow, clean line under my skin. There was a moment where I could have walked away and let mercy be my ending, but the buildings we build do not forgive us when we walk away. They keep their mistakes folded into their ventilation and their contracts, and one forgotten clause can be the difference between empire and ruin. In the echo of that lobby, my decision solidified like cooling metal. You don't get to call a place your life's work and then be erased. They had forgotten the blueprint, but I hadn't. They put me in a small glass meeting room that smelled like citrus cleaner and compressed confidence, and asked me to tell them why I was here. I unwrapped the blueprint from my coat like a relic, and put it on the table because sometimes paper makes people take you seriously the way an ID badge never could. Across from me sat a man with a haircut that looked like it had its own performance review and a tie that told me more about his salary than his spine. His name plate said Director of Systems, and his smile was the same one I had seen on a million corporate videos about disruption. He introduced himself like a fact, and then looked at me like a footnote he had no time for. I told him slowly because slow is the only voice that old stories answer, that there was a sequence in the old infrastructure that never failed unless you forced it to, and if you forgot to account for it, your redundancy would become a single point of failure. I pointed to the blueprint, fingers tracing a line to the maintenance hatch under the third stair. I explained that years ago we built a manual governor, a failsafe that would isolate the public cluster if the predictive model conflicted with sensor noise. We meant it to protect the city when the model learned the wrong thing. We called it the pause. It required physical confirmation from the control room and a key that I had designed to be impossible to forge without the original spec. The director laughed out loud in a way that did not include his eyes. The laugh was curated, the kind you practice between talking points. He said, and I remember each syllable like a legal strike, "This is adorable. Do you know how many times we have automated the governors? Grandpa," he said grandpa like it was a feature and not a wound. He told me about their white papers and their continuous deployment pipelines, and how they had moved everything to the cloud because clouds are progress and progress does not need relics. He waved his hand as if waving away a fly in a suit. He said they had everything buttoned up, that machine learning handled edge cases now, and that their incident response was orchestrated across vertically integrated playbooks. He used the word orchestrated like a hymn, and I sat there holding the blueprint like an old hymn book whose pages they thought were ornate. I felt the color leave the boardroom and form a cold bruise behind my sternum. He was not just dismissing my warning, he was erasing me. He told a woman to write down my concerns as legacy noise, and suggested a wellness check for my possible cognitive decline. One of them suggested a tour of the new user experience to remind me of how far they'd come without me. I wanted to tell them the pause was more than code. I wanted to tell them about the night the servers overheated and how we had 3 hours and very little sleep to decide which markets to save. I wanted to tell them how I had put a clause in the founder's agreement that allowed a touch, a key, a voice, to unlock a manual override because I had lost power once and the humanness of decision had saved billions. I wanted to say that no machine ever felt the smell of burning plastic and stayed calm enough not to panic. Instead, I watched the director flip through a glossy presentation on his laptop, the same presentation millions of dollars had convinced investors to love, and I realized they had modernized away the memory of what kept them alive. He looked at me and said that my era had been essential but irrelevant now, that the company had scaled, that it needed leaders who could think in matrices and not in memory. He leaned back, showing off the ease of someone whose trouble had been quantified and scheduled. You could see the security cameras in the corners of the ceiling, polite witnesses to the dismissal. He told me as if offering comfort that I should enjoy my legacy and perhaps write a memoir. Memoir. The word landed like a gavel. I had almost said something sharp then, about the difference between legacy and ledger. But I held my tongue because anger spoken in that room would have been catalogued and weaponized against me. When they suggested security walk me to the exit, the director added with a smile like a final seal that they loved hearing from community elders and it was great PR. He said it so cleanly it made my hands itch. I felt foolish for wanting anything else. I had not come for praise. I had come because I saw a hairline fracture in their foundation and because a fracture left untreated grows like rust. They closed their notebooks and told me to enjoy the building tour while PR coordinated a heritage piece. They assigned a junior associate to escort me through the humming halls, as if I needed supervision to breathe. The associate had a lanyard heavy with access tokens and a face that had not yet learned how to look at a man and register a lifetime. Walking out of that room, escorted like baggage, I tasted the old copper of memory and the new lemon of their indifference and knew two things with a clarity that felt like purpose. First, the pause still existed because you cannot unmake a manual switch simply by writing it off as superstition. Second, they would never accept advice born of hands and knights. They only accepted metrics. That made my next step certain in a way that scared me. If they would not listen, I would have to show them. I would make them feel the fracture before the fracture took them all. The blueprint burned in my coat like a quiet promise. I sat in a corner booth of a cafe that smelled like burnt sugar and new foam, the kind of place where people came to pretend they were busy and important. The rain was still leaking from the hem of my coat and leaving a salt ring on the wood. I unfolded the thin paper blueprint again out of habit, and let the inked lines blur with coffee steam, just long enough to make the building look older and more honest than it did in real life. My hands shook slightly when I reached for my pen, not from fear, but because the muscles you do not use begin to talk back. I pulled a blank page from a small notebook and started drawing because drawing is how I make machines speak. Memory is a strange thing. It does not come as a file but as a weather pattern. A smell, a hinge, the tick of a relay will blow open a room I thought had been boarded up. The image that came first was the original control console, 20 years and a dozen redesigns ago. It had a switch labeled pause and a brass keyhole we laugh about in boardrooms now because you cannot buy brass with venture capital. I had installed that keyhole with my own hands to make sure one human could stop the machine if the machine learned the wrong lesson. I had called it a fail-safe then and a superstition later. I traced the route from that console in my notebook until the ink looked familiar again. The kill switch was not something you could flip from a touchscreen or tweet into existence. It was a ceremony disguised as architecture. The company had grown a digital heart that beat with telemetry and proprietary models, but the original heart was mechanical and awkward and had a temperament. It lived in a decommissioned pump room under the municipal tram line, a place where pigeons nested and forgotten civvies slept at night. I had put the fail-safe there on purpose, because only someone with a map of last century would think to look. I had also hidden another piece of it in the company's charter, a clause written into a printed binder kept in a lawyer's safe deposit box that would, when invoked, force a governance lock and a manual audit. You needed both the physical and the legal to make the pause happen. It was messy and deliberate. I drew the tram line from memory, then shaded the service doors and sketched the access hatch behind a delivery ramp where routine audits never reached. I drew the old pump room console, its hand crank and heavy gauge wiring that modern engineers would call barbaric. I wrote down the code phrase, the kind of nonsense I had used to remember combinations. Old songs, a train line, my first cat. It was ridiculous and perfect. The company had traded complexity for elegance, and in that trade they had made themselves brittle. My blueprint in the mind filled pages as if the past were reassembling itself. As I worked, I thought of the people inside the tower. They did not hate me personally. They were indifferent in a new way that felt worse. Indifference is a machine's default and arrogance learns it like a language. They would, I knew, dismiss any warning as noise until the noise became a fire alarm. That understanding sharpened my plan. If I wanted them to listen, I could not only speak. I would have to make the failure undeniable and then hold the antidote in my hand when the cameras came running. I would be the man with the key and the patience to use it. I would force a choice on them, admit the past mattered or watch their empire trip over the seam of history. There was a moral shape to what I was doing that I had to measure. Destroying everything, harming strangers, or causing panic was not my aim. The pause existed to protect people, not to punish. So my plan had to be surgical. I would trigger the warning sequence from outside the company by creating a false pattern in the city's sensor grid that would look like a real anomaly to their models. I could do that because I knew which streetlights sent what noise and which ad displays had microphone sync that their models trusted. Small things, mundane things, that would be read by 1,000 algorithms as a systemic failure. Theirs would be the kind of failure born of hubris. They would assume the models were infallible and escalate. I mapped the cascade in my notebook. Sensor perturbation, model overconfidence, automated mitigation, backup depletion, then a forced handoff to operators who would be blind because they had never practiced manual. The choreography was ugly, but it was precise. I would not blow the building up. I would make the building trip over its own invisible shoelace. Then, when the board convened and the feeds were down and the investors were in panic, I would show up not as a madman, but as the man who could stop it with a turn of a key and the invocation of a clause. That was the reveal I needed. Show them their dependence and my authority at once. As I drew, memories of people I trusted flashed in thumbnails. The old night watch Ramos who knew how to replace fuse blocks by ear. The first engineer Lynn who left because they would not listen to her early warnings about dataset bias. They were ghosts whose names I kept as bookmarks. I considered calling them. Then I folded the corner of my page, hiding the most sensitive details like a priest keeping a confession. I knew I could not trust everyone, and I did not want the plan to become gossip before it had teeth. This had to be precise and held tight. The pen left a small ink smudge where my finger had rested too long. That smudge looked like a dot on a map, a place to begin. My body rose in protest when I stood to leave, my knees agreeing that time had changed the rules of motion, but my mind did not waver. The blueprint was no longer just lines on paper. It was a legal memory and a mechanical ritual folded into muscle memory. I had the pieces I needed and a map of how to get them into place. The real work would be to move in a world that had forgotten how to expect the old ways, to bait their arrogance into revealing the fracture. I tucked the notebook back into my coat, feeling the paper warm from my hands, and stepped into the rain with a plan that tasted like justice and copper. I did the thing I had sworn I would never enjoy again, which was to feel clever in the dark like a teenager breaking into his first server. And my hands shook not from the thrill but from the weight of what cleverness could do. I sat at a public terminal in a dowdy library because the company had turned its surveillance on like a dog, and my own phone would have been traced back to my rainy coat from the lobby. The terminal smelled of disinfectant and old paper, and outside a bus hissed like a tired animal. I typed the old username that used to open closets and safes and drawn curtains in the days before encryption was a religion, and I smiled at the memory of the phrase I had used to hide passwords in plain sight, the name of a tram line, my first cat, and the date of the first server crash. It read like nonsense, but it was a mnemonic for a lifetime of locks. I hit enter, and the dormant console woke up in a way I had not expected it to. The screen refreshed with a login screen that looked like my handwriting had been preserved in silicon. The flaw was old and human and beautiful. Somewhere in a series of updates and mergers and boardroom whiteboard washes, someone had left a back door open because it was convenient, and because the people who loved convenience did not think like burglars. The maintenance API had been deprecated but never removed. Firmware on 100 roadside ad displays still accepted legacy ping packets for calibration. Those pings, when they matched a narrow frequency pattern, were treated by the models as ground truth and were used to recalibrate sensor fusion. If you could make those pings even faintly, you could make the city's eyes blink. That was enough for a model that had been trained to trust certain kinds of signal above context. In short, I could nudge the models with a handful of ghostly beeps and watch them chase shadows. I sent the packet the way a priest sends a prayer, careful of timing and cadence, and I watched the logs scroll like a hymn. The system accepted it. A maintenance command propagated, a note was written to a queue, and a small update was dispatched to a cluster of ad displays in 3 neighborhoods. Nothing dramatic, just a calibration routine that altered microphone sensitivity by fractions. That fraction would matter when the city learned to be a chorus for itself. I closed the terminal and my chest felt hollow and full at once. The first electronic key had turned without me lifting a finger in the server room, which felt like both a miracle and an admission that decades of work could now be moved by a few lines of code. Then I made another move that no model could predict because it required a human with rusty knees and a memory for doorways. I called Ramos on a payphone I knew still worked near the tram yards, and his voice came out of the phone like gravel and kindness. He had been the night watch back when night meant keeping fires in the engine rooms, not monitoring dashboards. He answered with the same dry humor that had kept him alive through bad heat and worse bosses. I told him I needed him to open the old pump room at midnight and to bring the heavy brass key we used to hang on the inside of the patrol locker. He did not ask why. There are favors owed between men who have kept the same machines alive, and Ramos had a ledger that did not count in dollars. When we met, the tram yard smelled of oil and rain. Ramos had a scarf and a face that had been softened by years and hardened by the city. He handed me the brass key without second-guessing the fact that I still had a reason to use it. The key was warm because he had been holding it in his palm, a little ritual of trust. The pump room was the kind of place that no one writes about because it is where the ugly truth of infrastructure lives. We climbed down steps that remembered our boots and found the console I had drawn in the cafe, the one with the hand crank and the rusted bolts. The gauge read within acceptable bounds, but there was a small relay I had labeled years ago as a dampener. It had been wired to make the mechanical governor respond to tiny oscillations in the city's power supply. Turning it would not break the city, but it would reintroduce the analog noise that the models had been taught never to trust. My hand closed around the key. For a moment the building felt like a sleeping animal, and the key was the small knife you use to test whether an animal snores. I turned it. The sound it made was a solid, honest click like a verdict. The pump purred an answer and the old relay lit a tired amber. The analog heartbeat was back in the loop. In the servers, the logs would not yet show much. In the models, the calibration change I had sent would begin to be interpreted under a slightly different bias now that the physical layer was speaking in a language the models had been trained to trust. It was a small shift, a turning of a key that reopened an old conversation between metal and streetlight. Ramos looked at me with the kind of look that had nothing to do with youth or money and everything to do with being part of something older than both. He said low and steady, "Are you sure you want to do this?" He did not mean the mechanics. He meant the consequences. I had gone from wanting to be seen to wanting them to understand, and that is a dangerous line to cross. I told him I did. I told him what mattered. This was about making them choose to remember or to fall. He nodded like a man who had been asked to hold a gate and had agreed because gates need holding. We left the pump room and the night folded itself over us like a map closing. The first domino had moved because of a little packet sent from a dusty terminal and because of a brass key turned by calloused fingers. I knew the next moves would require timing and courage and the ugly patience of someone who has seen empires built on faith and fraud. The city would cough, the models would clear their throats, and people in shirts with names on them would start to make the kinds of phone calls that break into headlines. I walked away feeling like an old man who had finally set a clock he made himself. The plan was now in motion, and the room of glass and lemon oil would not know the sound of the first key until the door had already begun to crack. The first ripple was almost comical, the kind of thing you see in a bad sitcom before the credits. I was making tea in a chipped mug when my phone lit up with a push alert. A dozen downtown ad displays had started looping a strange calibration animation instead of scheduled ads. The animation was harmless, a slow spiral of pixels, but it had a subtitle no one had meant to show on a public screen, a scrap of diagnostic text that said in plain English, sensor confidence below threshold. People noticed. They took pictures, they made jokes. The company rolled out an official statement that evening saying it was a software update glitch, that everything was under control. Their confidence sounded like a recorded voice. I had a kettle and a key and a notebook, and a face that had been rubbed raw by that same word control. Then the models started arguing with themselves. Their customer support assistant began answering with fragments of internal logs, an ugly stream of timestamps and error codes that looked like a confession. Phones rang in the newsroom with audio of the assistant explaining why it recommended a product to a user who had not asked for it, and how it had learned preference from an unlabeled feed. The assistant's voice bot, which they had sold as a transparency feature, started adding parenthetical asides about human override missing. The PR people called that morning with breathless tones and patched me into a live feed that showed the CEO, smiling too hard, trying to demo a new feature, and instead being interrupted by the assistant announcing a pending service suspension for anticipated model divergence. The CEO fumbled, the smile froze, and the live stream turned into a slow-motion reveal of a room full of people who had never practiced crisis without an engineer to click a button. Their playbooks failed in beautiful symmetry. The orchestration platform they praised in their investor decks attempted to push a rollback, then detected inconsistent state and froze. Their automation, designed to manage failure at scale, had never been tested against a failure that spoke at the physical layer and the legal layer at once. The platform's decision trees, trained on neat controlled outages, were flummoxed by a chorus of tiny analog blips plus a legal binder nobody had thought to check. They called consultants who had PhDs in optimism and spreadsheets, and the consultants produced slides that were mostly colorful and very wrong. They blamed vendors, they blamed the city grid, they blamed anyone whose name wasn't on the founder's plaque. That was the moment I felt both vindicated and sad, because I recognized in their panic the same fear I had felt during bad deploys and the same rush of naive certainty that hides itself behind corporate jargon. The board convened an emergency meeting and the camera crews came, because crisis is news and news is theater. The CEO walked in like a man entering a courtroom he had hired the jury for. He read from prepared statements about resilience and timelines, and every canned answer fell apart under follow-up questions. A journalist asked a simple question about manual override and the CEO's face folded. He said we have multiple redundancies, which was true and incomplete. He said our systems are robust and transparent, which was marketing and not an answer. The director of systems, the one who called me adorable, appeared in a video call and he looked smaller. He tried to reassure investors that fail-safes existed, and then he had to admit that some legacy components were off the audit list because they were not scalable. The admittance sounded like a betrayal when spoken aloud. Small things grew teeth. Delivery bots began misrouting packages to abandoned storefronts because the geofencing overlay had been recalibrated by the ad display packets, and the edge models began trusting the wrong origin points. An influencer live stream trended because she got stuck in an elevator controlled by the building's access system, which had hiccuped thanks to a cascade of credential refreshes that were now failing due to the governance lock the legal binder invoked. No one was hurt, but people were inconvenienced in ways that amplified into social media chaos. Hashtags trended. Investors looked at numbers and bruised their faces in their hands. The stock went down in one clean, inexorable line, and with every slide the people on stage sounded less like leaders and more like actors reading a script they had not written. I watched all of it from my apartment window, the city lights like an aggressive kind of constellations, and felt a curious mixture of triumph and guilt. I had not intended to punish anyone who was doing their job honestly, and I had taken pains to avoid turning the glitch into a catastrophe. My trigger was a lesson, not a vendetta. Still, when the headlines started saying system failure and pundits called it a hack, and the director of systems blamed sophisticated external adversaries, I felt the old memory of my own youth's recklessness sharpen into something colder. I had set the dominoes with surgical hands and I was watching them obey me. But the public panic that grows from technological failure is a thing that feeds on rumor and fear faster than any carefully drawn plan. Late that night Ramos called, and his voice was steady as the tram lines had always been. He had been on night rounds and had seen the empty ads and the strangeness at the yards. We spoke quietly because we both wanted the city to sleep and not wake to worry. He told me that the old watch crew had patched things where they could and had kept people safe. That was enough. I told him I would make them choose. I would not let them hide behind their own PR and their own arrogance. The machines would cough louder until the managers looked up from their dashboards and remembered the human parts they had outsourced. It was not malice, I told myself, but memory insisting on being recognized. Tomorrow the chaos would deepen or it would calm. Either way, the conversation had begun, and listening back, I knew the next moves would demand steadiness and a final reveal. I poured out the rest of my tea and waited to see whether the people who had once called me Ghost would know what kind of thing haunted them. The email came like a small, bright thing in the dark, the kind of impossible hope you get when you have been pushed out to the curb and are suddenly noticed by someone in a shiny car. It was from a junior ops analyst named Maya, someone I had seen once handing out lanyards at a community meet years ago. She had found an archived scan page of the original charter in a dusty legal binder the company had uploaded to a compliance portal and then forgotten to take down. Her message was short and raw, the kind of message that people write when adrenaline makes them honest. She said simply, "We found something. Do you still know the old manual override?" She called me by the nickname they had used in the early days, the one the interns loved to share in party stories, and in that single sentence there was a kind of apology I had not expected. Someone smaller than them remembered me and needed me, and remembering can be dangerous for those who built on amnesia. When they called me, the building felt colder than the last time. Emergency lights washed the lobby in a clinical blue, and the digital sculpture that used to intimidate me now blinked like a wounded animal. I arrived the way a man goes to a funeral for a thing he loved, careful, measured, and carrying a private grief. Security scanned my visitor badge like it contained an anthrax threat, and the director of systems hovered by the entrance like a man waiting for a verdict he did not want to hear. The CEO met me in the glass atrium and the camera phones were already out. They wanted a spectacle because spectacle soothes investors. I watched his hands tremble the way someone trembles before a confession. He did not say sorry in the clear, honest way I would have preferred. He said sorry in the shape of practical questions, those modern apologies that come with action items, deadlines, and bullet points. They put me in a conference room that smelled faintly of ozone and fear, and offered me a seat like an offering to a king they had dethroned in a pantomime. The low-level crisis team hovered at the edges, interns holding tablets with live transcripts, and a junior engineer named Maya standing with her arms folded as if she had been carrying this moment carefully for weeks. She looked younger in person, more solid than the emails suggested, and there was a hunger in her eyes that I recognized as the first true hunger I had felt for invention. On the other side of the table, the director of systems maintained a brittle grin. He had been the man who had called me adorable and suggested I write a memoir. Now he spoke into a mic like a man rehearsing the language of humility. He asked for my counsel, for a list of things that could be done to restore confidence, and for a public statement that would reassure shareholders. I listened to them as they flailed about their playbooks, and I let the silence grow long enough to be meaningful. Being summoned by the players who once shoved me aside feels like a return to a stage I never wanted to revisit. There is a particular brand of quiet that follows someone who has built things with their hands. The room vibrated with the nervous energy of people who have never had to wrestle a machine into obedience with a wrench and a sentence. Maya, in a voice steadier than I expected, told the room where she had found the clause, how she had traced the annotations to a faded code comment that matched my handwriting, and how the founder's binder referenced a manual governance procedure that required both a physical act and a legal invocation. She said it with the pride of someone who had dug for the truth and refused to let it stay buried. Their eyes slid to me with a mixture of hope and hunger, like travelers who have finally found a map to a hidden spring. The CEO asked plainly and without theater if I could bring the pause back, if I could stop whatever noise had upset the models and convince the market that the company was not at risk. He wanted a checklist. He wanted timelines. He wanted cheap certainty that feeds quarterly reports. The director of systems added that the board would need a written procedure, full audit logs and validation steps. It was a list of modern necessities that felt like a gauntlet to my hands. I thought of Ramos and the brass key cooling in my pocket and of the pump room we had wound like a secret clock. I thought about Lynn, who had been dismissed when she spoke of bias, and the way the company had traded muscle memory for dashboards. I told them I could help, but I set my price in a way they had not expected. I would not become a marketing prop for an apology piece. I would not walk on stage like a smiling relic and let them present me as an endorsement of their genius. I demanded two things. First, unconditional access to the systems and the legal binder to perform the manual sequence myself, not through a proxy. Second, a public acknowledgement that the founder's provision existed and that governance would be re-examined. It was not blackmail. It was leverage made honest. The room stiffened because leverage is the sound of truth when truth has been off the schedule for a long time. The CEO hesitated, the board would hate it, investors might panic, but without me they had no route to restore control. Maya's hand found mine under the table, a small, fierce reassurance that the choice I asked for could be made. They argued in halves, counting risks with the detachment of people who have learned to prefer calculations over courage. The director of systems argued that public acknowledgement could worsen sentiment. The legal counsel whispered about shareholder suits, and the PR director fidgeted with a card that said message discipline. When they finally agreed, it was because a lawyer calculated odds and found them lower without my help. They granted my terms with the sour face of men signing away something they did not fully understand. The concession was my first small victory. I walked out of that room like a man who had been offered the stage and had taken it with his own script. The cameras followed, but the story was no longer theirs to frame. They had summoned a ghost, and the ghost had teeth and a plan that had only just begun to show. They led me into the boardroom like they were bringing a relic to an appraisal, a place with glass walls and a long table that reflected everyone as if they were performers on a stage. The cameras were already set up, the press in the back like gray moths drawn to light. The CEO smiled the way a man smiles before he tries to sell you hope, and the director of systems stationed himself like a lieutenant prepared to explain away failure with PowerPoint. Maya sat at the end of the table with her tablet open, eyes bright and steady, as if she had been waiting for this lesson longer than any of them. When they told me to begin, the room bent in on itself with expectation and a thin thread of dread. I started slow because slow gives you the room. I said nothing about tricks or revenge. I spoke about nights when servers smelled like burnt plastic and the city felt like a patient on a ventilator. I spoke about a time when decisions were made by hands that had earned calluses and by people who stayed with the code when the tests failed. I reminded them of the first outage, the one that taught me that humans and machines were not equals in crisis because humans remember what machines forget. I told the room that the feature they were panicked about was not an accident, but the last honest thing I had put into the architecture before the maps got redrawn for investors. I walked the room through it like a teacher walking students through an old, difficult poem. The pause was not a blunt kill switch meant to halt for the thrill of power. It was a moral instrument. I had built it to do two things: isolate the model layer from real-world effect when sensor confidence failed and force governance to show its face. If an automated cascade threatened to act on corrupted inputs, the pause would act like a lighthouse, slowing the machine long enough for a human to make a value judgment. But here is the part no one in that room had read because they had never looked past the dashboard. I coded a second behavior into the system, a behavior I call the mirror. If governance could not be reached, if a manual affirmation and legal invocation were not produced within a set interval, the mirror would publish redacted logs to public channels and trigger a governance lock that made board actions visible in real time. I did that on purpose. I made the system refuse to hide when the people in charge chose to hide instead. For 20 years I had carried that clause like a hidden tooth in my mouth. I had put the legal invocation in the binder and the brass key in the pump room because I did not trust a system that could be silenced by a boardroom memo. I knew the kinds of men who would prefer pleasant slides to difficult truths, and I decided they should not be allowed to choose invisibility when things went wrong. The mirror was a modest kind of justice, transparency enforced by code when humans declined to act. It was not revenge, it was a nudge toward responsibility. The room listened the way a crowd listens to thunder from a distant storm. There were faces flushed with anger, some with the white flash of surprise that leaks from two bright screens. The director of systems opened his mouth and closed it again like someone who had practiced denial until the word itself felt foreign. The CEO looked like a man who had been given a script and was told the pages were wrong. Cameras leaned in, their lenses wet with the cost of truth. Then I stopped the lecture and reached into my coat. I did it slowly because theater is the honest cousin of truth and the world responds to measured moments. I pulled out the original folding blueprint, the same paper that had wandered in my pocket like a faithful old dog, and I set it on the table between us. The ink had smudged where coffee had kissed it, and there were notes in margins only someone who had slept with the machine would understand. I slid across a photocopy of the charter page with my handwriting in the corner, an annotation naming the mirror and the pause in the very plain language of someone who used law as a last resort. When I said plainly I built this place, I watched the air move like a physical thing. The CEO blinked first, a beat behind the rest, and then the room went quiet in a way that makes your throat ache. Silence fell not as absence but as recognition. Faces shuddered into the reality of what they had erased by ignoring the past. Someone in the back muttered, "He is the founder," like a verdict finally read aloud. The director of systems, who had laughed at me and called me a museum piece, looked like he had been struck by the weight of his own words. He could not hide that he had never wanted the messy human parts to be part of his spreadsheets. I did not need to shout. I did not need to gloat. I told them the rules I had written would force a decision on them, either accept a public review of the failures and the people who ignored warnings or watch the mirror make those reviews public on its own. I told them the brass key existed and so did the binder, and that unless they agreed to a transparent path forward, the system would continue to publish until someone with authority met the manual requirement. I named names where necessary and kept other things private, because naming too many ghosts is cruelty without purpose. The stunned silence lasted long enough for me to feel every year of my life folding into one clear thing. Then slowly, the CEO stood. He apologized in the way men in the public eye apologize when the facts crowd the words, carefully, with a lawyer half-sitting in the sentence. He agreed to my terms because he had no choice. The director of systems argued about optics, which is to argue about the art of hiding when everyone now knew you had been hiding. Maya looked at me and smiled like someone who had found a key and a teacher at once. When I left the room, the cameras were still following, but the story was no longer only theirs to tell. I had given them a way back to dignity if they wanted it, and I had also given them a mirror they could not look away from. The lesson was simple and cruel in equal measure. You build a thing and it remembers you whether you remember it. I had not returned to reclaim credit. I had returned to demand honesty, to make them choose to keep what they had built without erasing the hands that made it. The founder in me had always preferred repair over revenge, but I would not be erased without making sure the next generation learned why we left the safety of the old knights. The room had learned its first lesson, and the world outside was waiting to see whether they would heed it. I laid the paper on the table and let the room read it as if it were an indictment and a promise at the same time. The terms were not written as threats but as the anatomy of repair. I wanted them to understand that this was not personal vengeance dressed up as justice. It was a set of actions that would either bring the company back to the world it had promised to change or let it fall apart like an unloved machine. The cameras hummed like flies. The director of systems tried to lean forward and negotiate away the parts he did not like, and the CEO looked like a man trying to measure the cost of not agreeing. First, the leadership. The CEO and the director of systems would step down immediately and remain off executive duties during a public audit. They would be replaced by an interim stewardship council led by people who understood the architecture of both code and consequence. I named Maya as chair of the council because she had found the binder, and because hunger for truth is more useful than a title. Maya would be paired with Ramos and Lin, the practical minds who had kept the physical world running, and a handful of independent trustees chosen by community and independent auditors. No boardroom puppet theater. Real accountability that could not be gamed by PR or spun with investor slides. Second, governance and transparency. The mirror and pause provisions had to be treated not as a trick but as civic infrastructure. The legal binder would be published in full, redactions only for privacy, and the governance lock would become an audited mechanism, not a scandal trigger. I insisted that the mirror code be extracted from proprietary vaults, documented, and released under a license that allowed independent verification. If you build power into a system, you have a duty to allow others to check the levers. They balked at open source at first. Investors hate uncertainty. But I told them plainly that their current secrecy had already cost more than honesty ever would. Third, the company needed to return to its original mission rather than its current religion of scale. That sounded vague in a boardroom, so I made it specific. A portion of the equity would be placed into an employee and community trust. Pensions and health for the maintenance crews who actually keep the city moving would be guaranteed. Research budgets would be ring-fenced for safety audits and bias mitigation, not only for growth metrics. Any project that affected public life would require a human review and a named officer accountable for outcomes, not just models with neat charts. I made them write the commitments into the charter then and there, because promises spoken in air are easy to forget. Fourth, restitution and protection. I demanded that people marginalized or pushed aside for raising inconvenient truths be offered reinstatement where appropriate, restitution where harm was provable, and protection from retaliation. Lynn would get her job offer back or an equivalent position she accepted, and Ramos would be given a formal role for physical systems oversight. There were names on my list, not for headlines, but because a company that erases memory cannot be trusted to build futures. They argued about precedent and risk, and I argued back with the kind of stubbornness you get from keeping machines alive in the night. Finally, the public apology and the learning center. The company would issue a clear, plain language statement about what happened, why the pause existed, and how the mirror came to be used. No spin. Then they would fund a small public institute in the old server room, a place for study of infrastructure ethics and hands-on training for the kind of technicians they had forgot. If you want a future that can be trusted, you teach people to look under the hood. The cameras liked this part because it made a good ending on paper, but I did not want an ending. I wanted an ecosystem of checks that would keep the ending open. When I finished laying out the list, I looked at each of them and told them plainly what would happen if they refused. The mirror would remain active, continuing to publish redacted logs and insisting on a governance lock until the council was formed and the public audit scheduled. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The brass key in my pocket felt heavy but honest. They had two choices. They could accept a hard, public path to repair, or they could watch the company implode into rumor, lawsuits, and the slow death of consumer trust. The room counted risks like accountants measure wounds, and I could see minds doing the cold math. The CEO signed first because he had already counted the losses of inaction. The director of systems waited until Maya touched his hand under the table, a small human signal that this was not about exile but about correction. He signed with the reluctance of a man who has been asked to consider humility. Cameras flashed and the headlines would come, but in that small motion the company chose a path that made my heart lighter. I did not take the throne back. I refused offers to be a figurehead or to return to the executive suite. What I asked for was protection for the thing I had built and a firewall against the kind of forgetting that breeds arrogance. That was the real price of forgetting, the slow theft of purpose. They had signed to pay it back in structure, not in speeches. When the meeting broke, I walked out with no applause but with a new kind of quiet. People in the lobby looked at me differently, not as a ghost or a curiosity, but as someone who had brought them a choice. My blueprint remained folded in my coat, the brass key cool against my ribs, and the mirror remained a threat until deeds matched words. I had reclaimed the soul of what I built in the only way it could be reclaimed, by giving the company a chance to be honest and by making sure they could never forget the hands that got them there. The next days would be messy, public, and unforgiving, but they would also be corrective, because memory, once demanded, is hard to ignore.